Is the great Australian dream of owning your own home dead? And if so, what does this mean for property investors and property homeowners in Australia? Well, today I wanted to cover this exact topic. And it's very much been fueled by the recent news articles you'd have to be living under a rock to ignore about home affordability, the rental crisis, and essentially the current state of the Australian property market. And it really got me thinking, has home ownership percentages changed that much in the last 30 years? And if so, what are we seeing? So I thought I'd jump into the Australian Bureau of Statistics data and have a look and see over time what has changed with dwelling structures, what percentage of people are renting now compared to previously, and then hypothesize on what that might lead to into the future. So jumping into it, having a look at the Australian Bureau of Statistics data, and unfortunately this data is a little bit old. Essentially the ABS only do a census every 5 years. The last census was done just last year, but the data is yet to be released, so it won't be far away until we have that new data, which will be certainly exciting to see, because it's going to paint a really strong picture of where Australia is heading in so many different regards. But looking at the data from 1994 to 2017, there's a couple of really clear trends that start to become evident. First of all, in 1994, just 18% of the population were renting a home privately. So from a private landlord, were renting their home, just 18%. Where by 2017, this had shot up to 27% of the population. So that's a 48% increase in the number of people renting a property when compared to those that owned. So a really big jump in the rental market, 18% to 27%, or a 48% increase. The other interesting stat that was in this data was the amount of housing supplied by government, so government-owned housing. Back in 1994, it was sitting at 5.5%, and we've seen a 43% decrease to 3.1%. So a massive decrease in the amount of government housing being supplied to the market. So that's interesting, looking at the media once again and the arguments of the politicians that they're making housing affordable, but yet they've stopped supplying government housing. They're leaning away from that and relying more on the private sector to supply housing to the Australian sort of residents. Now, when you look at this data, you go 27% of the population, almost a third of the population's renting. That seems extremely high, and it got me wondering, where does that compare to other countries? Where does that compare to the US, New Zealand, Europe? And it got me looking at the international data, and I'll bring up a website here for you to have a look at. You can see Australia is pretty close to the USA. We're both sitting around 65% of the population own their own home. Where you look down in New Zealand and the UK, and that number drops, and more people are renting. And you go down to even Switzerland, where 60% of the population are currently renting their own property. So home ownership in Switzerland's only about 4 in 10 people actually own their own home. So it's pretty much inverse of what we're seeing in Australia. So you can see that the trend of more people renting is growing worldwide, and Australia is not on its own in this. Housing affordability is an issue worldwide, and more people are choosing to rent rather than buy. And that's going to have some really interesting implications moving into the future. So one of the big reasons you hear that more people are renting is affordability. And this is quite an interesting one. You look at the recent government schemes, like the 5% first home buyer scheme, the 2% single parenting scheme, and Labor's latest proposition of a shared equity scheme. Now, these schemes aren't so much there to make property more affordable in the fact that they're not making property cheaper, but they're just making it easier for first home buyers to actually access the market. So this in turn is propping up the market and helping prices stay quite steady, which if you think about the government's role and as an investor or a homeowner, it's interesting to know that the government aren't actually looking to make construction cheaper and encouraging new developments per se, but they're just trying to make it easier for people to get into the market. So it's an interesting one, especially when you're looking at affordability. I don't think the government schemes really help with affordability per se. They just make it easier for people to get into the market. Coming back to affordability as well, the market that I work in, Cairns, and the market where I've invested quite a bit in is the Cairns property market. And arguably it's one of the more affordable markets in Australia. Back in 2016, when the last census was done, you could buy a house in Cairns for under 400,000, and I think by anyone's books, that's a pretty affordable market. But yeah, when you look at the rental data for the area, in 2016, almost 39% of the population were renting a property. So it shows even with affordable prices, there's still a massive appetite for rental properties, and that isn't changing. You look at those trends from that earlier graph, and more people are opting for rental properties, be it for the simplicity of being able to move from one location to the next, be it being able to live in areas that they couldn't afford to buy, or be it for budget reasons they simply can't afford to buy. There is a big appetite for rental properties in Australia, and like I showed, worldwide there is that big appetite for rental properties. So knowing that, and knowing that rental properties are on the rise and more people are choosing to rent than buy, what does this mean as a homeowner or as a property investor, and what can we see moving into the future? Firstly, like anything, rental properties are a supply and demand market. And with more people demanding rental properties and there being more demand for rental properties, and supply being limited, and you look at with the latest inflation data, construction's dropping right back and the cost of new homes is skyrocketing, the supply is limited of what rental properties are out there. So when you've got a really strong demand for a product and a really limited supply, of course prices are going to continue going upwards. Moving forward, I think what we're going to see moving into the future is the government incentivise a little bit more investors buying into the property and supplying that rental stock. Over the last decade, we've had higher stamp duty for investors looking to buy, higher interest rates for investors looking to buy, and government policies sort of skewed well in the tenant's favour rather than the landlord's favour. And I think this is going to change into the future. I think we're going to possibly see stamp duty equal out a little bit, or other incentives come into play for people to build and rent properties or buy properties and offer them to the rental market. So that's going to be an interesting thing to keep our eye on over the next decade, is how the government actually handles the growing rental market and how they move to make it more affordable and especially create more supply in the rental market. My last big note on this topic is I really feel we're going to see a growing wealth gap in Australia between those that have property, be it as their own primary place of residency or investment properties, and those that don't. So if you are in a market at the moment, you might live in Sydney or Melbourne and just don't feel like it is feasible to actually buy into the market where you want to live, maybe buying a property and renting it out in another market might be a move that would make sense to you. So I think to get on the right side of that wealth gap, owning property is going to become a big part of the difference between those that have and those that don't have. So there you have it. That's my thoughts on the Great Australian Dream, the increase in rental properties and the increase in the percentage of people renting, and a few predictions into the future. I hope you've enjoyed this video like my other ones. If you have, make sure you subscribe. We put out a heap of content on this channel and love bringing you new videos, and I look forward to talking to you soon.